Hello, everybody. My name is Gabriel Klaassen. I am from Project 90 by 2030, a social environmental justice organization based in Cape Town, South Africa, inspiring and mobilizing a low carbon generation. Joining me today as a co-host, Tina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Tina. I'm a researcher at Project 90 by 2030.
Excellent. And so today's webinar is in partnership with Heinrich Böll Foundation, and we kind of really want this to be a space where it can be a convergence of not only experiences from Germany and South Africa, but of networks of the two organizations as well, wanting to foster collaboration, partnership, and shared learning. It's not Germany sharing with South Africa or South Africa sharing with Germany, but meeting in the middle and discussing ways forward. And so I'm going to share on my screen just the kind of way that the session today will follow through. And then going forward, Tina will also then break us into who our panelists are as they speak in the allotted times that they are given. But once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We are truly appreciative. The recording will be shared after this and more information as well alongside that. Let me share my screen for a second. So today we're going to walk ourselves through a little bit of a kind of beginning presentation, not really a presentation, but just a shared experience of what justice means in the just energy transition, and dive a little bit more into depth on that, looking at lessons learned from the German coal exit as it stands right now. As you know, South Africa is a extremely high coal-intensive society, and are going through this just energy transition. We then move into the current situation within South Africa, the JET IP, the JET P, all the acronyms on that front. And we've got amazing experts who are here to kind of share and kind of contribute to the space. And of course, all of you here as well, in your lived and professional experience, those experiences matter tremendously. And that's why after the Q&A, we're going to move into a bit of a discussion of what we can do, how we can take action, and how we can bring forward a bit of change in our different spaces and spheres, and possibly foster collaboration and solidarity globally. And then bring it to a close. So for that, I say thank you very much and pass the mic to Tina as she introduces our first panelist.
Thank you, Gabriel. And yes, let's get straight to it. And we're going to start with Konrad Gürtler today. He's a political scientist and sustainability scholar working in the societal dimension of energy transition. And he's particularly interested in the relation between different perspectives on justice and scale in these transitions. And he's a doctoral fellow of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, research associate at the Research Institute for Sustainability in Potsdam, and pursues a PhD at the Radboud University at Nijmegen. Welcome, Konrad. Please start your presentation.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me and for these kind introductory words. I will just try and get my presentation started right now. Just a moment. So, can you guys see something already?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Are we getting there?
Yes, we can see your slide.
Perfect, very good. In the next 10 to 15 minutes, I wanted to just kick us off here today with a little bit of conceptual work, and then also tell you a little bit about my experiences and my research on the coal phase out and the just transition in Germany. So what I'm planning to do over the next couple of minutes is to start with these conceptual ideas on how we can make sense of differing claims for justice in transitions. And then we get a little bit deeper into the debates about just transitions in Germany, the role of participation therein, but also I will talk a little bit about the barriers and the obstacles to the transition that we see in local contestation processes. What I'm going to say will also link to the presentation from Pao Yu, so bear with us if there's some things that I might mention now already that I picked up upon later on. So to get right into it. Basically, when we talk about justice claims in transitions, there are different aspects of justice, different dimensions of justice that are usually negotiated here. And one framework that has become quite established in the field that I do my research in is to look at justice from the perspective of just distribution, just recognition, and just procedures. And by that, I mean that distributive justice would refer to aspects such as the distribution of burdens and benefits. There can be wealth and income, but it can be, of course, also the burdens of energy production and transmission, also the benefits of profiting from electricity. This is actually a very prominent field. It's usually very highly addressed. When we look at questions of recognition-based justice, we are actually talking about the aspect whether all parts of society can, equally are equally recognized and are not, culturally discriminated on the basis of either gender or race or ethnic belonging or other aspects, other identity aspects maybe. So this would be talking about recognition-based justice. And then the procedural aspect comes in when we look at whether all parts of society have an equal, possibility to participate, to be represented. We're talking here about aspects of access to decision-making, access to information, very importantly, and also, access to the legal system, for instance. And I see these, these three dimensions of justice as interacting quite strongly. So they are not only overlapping, but they actually stand in interaction. So if we look at an example of, a participatory process, let's say about a climate change bill or a just transition framework in South Africa, and the consultations are being held in Johannesburg or so, then the question of, distributive justice with people maybe having less financial means to, travel there and participate in such a meeting would then, overlap with these procedural questions, for instance. And so you have to make sure that people also have the financial means to participate, for instance. One other aspect that I also wanted to mention is that there's this dimension of restorative justice, which basically refers to the question of, how can we make sure that the wrongs of the past are actually also corrected to a certain extent, and that we arrive at a situation that is closer to what it was before certain negative effects happened. I think this is a very important one if we look at communities, but also if we look at the rise of nature, so to say. I also wanted to mention that these justice claims are embedded very strongly in contexts of space and time, and what I mean by that is saying that the kinds of justice claims that are raised in a local community might maybe be different from the kinds of global justice claims that are raised. I think somebody has his mic on at the moment. Maybe you can just mute your mic.
We'll make sure to do that now.
Yeah, thank you.
So from now onward, everyone's mic will be muted, and I'm just going to request that yours unmutes quickly. 1 second.
Yeah, perfect. So I just wanted to put that out that justice claims might be very differing from region to region in the context whether they are raised on a local level or at a national level or at a global level. And also the temporal aspect comes in here with regard to how fast or how slow should transitions happen. And there are different ideas about that. And also how are different generations affected by it. I think that's also an important point for our discussion here today. And last point I want to make on this one here is that we also need to question ourselves whether all justice claims that are negotiated with each other also have the same are equally relevant, have the same kind of normative relevance, because some of them might be, raised from a privileged position of, keeping a status quo as it was, whereas others, might come from a more marginalized perspective. And I think this is also important to keep in mind when we talk about justice in this context. So with this, first introduction, I just wanted to give you an idea of how we can think and talk about different claims to justice. And I would now like to carry on and take you a little bit closer to the German case, give you some introductions into the debates about justice in the energy transition in Germany. And this will then also connect nicely to what Pao Yu will present afterwards. I don't want to say too much about the coal phase-out process at this point, but maybe just, to give you a little bit of context, the decision was taken in Germany to phase out the remaining coal mining and coal power generation over a period of roughly 20 years. So this decision was taken in 2019. And back then it was said that until the mid of the 2030s, latest to the point of 2038, all of the coal power generation and mining will be phased out in Germany. And this decision was highly contested back then, and still is to a certain extent. But I think particularly in the last couple of years, the last 5 years or so, there was really quite a high contestation around these topics. It was generally, from my observation, less openly addressed as a justice concern. So if I compare it, for instance, to the South African case and the talk here about just transition, I think this is much stronger here. In Germany, the debate went a little bit different, but still we see that justice concerns are at the heart of some of the conflicts that we see between those that want a faster transition and those that want it to be slower and or maybe even objected overall. Back then, we have seen some opposition, actually quite considerable opposition towards an ambitious coal phase out from groups such as some trade unions, particularly in the field of industrial trade unions, of course, from energy companies. I mean, there are embedded interests there, and you know from the cases that you are closely involved with as well. From some of the regional actors as well, that were worried about the kind of economic transition happening in their regions. And I think what's maybe a little bit special about the German case is that there was also a very strong populist mobilization against this kind of, living up to global responsibilities and historic responsibilities. And so in some parts of Germany, and particularly in these regions that are strongly dependent on coal, we have seen that populist parties also used it, as a vehicle to mobilize very strongly against the coal phase out. And what happened then was that there was a search for a compromise that was carried out in a high-level stakeholder commission, so-called Coal Commission. We will hear a bit more about that later on. And so they basically reached this compromise of, phasing out coal by 2038 and mobilizing quite considerable amounts of funding, of structural support for those regions that are affected by it. And so this compromise, with the phase out and everything that I mentioned, actually remains still contested from different sides. And of course, I mean, things are moving on. The world is not the same as it was back in 2018, 2019. So we see that for those that still think that this transition is actually happening fast or maybe too fast, that there is, attempts to try to slow it down. This comes usually from arguments around the regional development, like what are we going to do after coal, basically, in these regions, but also with an eye to energy security. And I'm sure Pao Yu will mention this later on, the energy security arguments about, the Russian war on Ukraine and the role of coal in that. That would be from the side of, slowing down the transition. But then, of course, there's also the other side of, climate activists, particularly with a view to global climate justice, actually lobbying for, moving the state that was agreed there, moving the state forward, just because, we have a great urgency, and actually the urgency is now even greater than it was 5 years back. So also, paying attention to that. And so you see this compromise is still contested. And I think one point that we should also mention here, that we should talk about, is after the coal phase out decision is taken, where is this transition actually headed? And I think that's an important one, whether we talk about the German coal regions or we talk here about Mpumalanga and so on. Just, phasing out coal doesn't mean that what you bring in as, economic activities happening in this region is driven by an idea of climate justice and sustainability. And so that's a question that I'm very interested in at the moment. If people, bring in replacement economic activities, are these actually sustainable, or do you maybe even run into the same problems again that you had before? So this is just, to give you a flavor about the justice debates that we see happening in Germany. I also said in the beginning that I would move on and say a few words about the role of participation and transparency. And I think it's important to keep in mind that previous energy transitions in Germany have seen very mixed results. So some of them were more successful, others were, more complicated. But I think this is important to, give you a greater context. I'll say a few more words about it later on. This coal phase-out decision, as I said, was taken in a high-level stakeholder process, which included several important actors, such as trade unions, such as established environmental NGOs, like Greenpeace, for instance, businesses, regional actors. So it was quite a big commission with many participants, but it also excluded, I think, some of the important interest groups. So, for instance, youth organizations were not part of it. I think that's important to mention here. Also, some parts of the environmental movement that are more really focused on this global climate justice dimension strongly were not part of it. What we have seen is that this was more of a expert-led kind of negotiation taking place there. They did a lot of hearings of different experts, but what, for instance, did not take place very strongly was a community engagement. And comparing this to other approaches, maybe even here in South Africa, but also in other cases that I looked at, I think that is a missed opportunity in the German case. So they did not really have during the work of this commission, a chance for communities also to raise their concerns here. This is like what happened in this commission. And then this commission was over beginning of 2019. At the same time, we saw that in these regions that are affected by this coal transition, there was this idea to set up participatory processes through citizen councils, through, consultation processes. And I have had a look into some of them in the Eastern German part, in the Eastern German coal region. And what we have seen there in the beginning was that it was actually not so successful. And I think one of the problems here was that there was a lack of alignment and meaningful possibility for the input, in the sense that certain decisions were already taken in this commission. So then people felt like, well, why should I still engage if there's already a vision for my region, drafted out without us being consulted? So I think that's a way not to do it. I think the problem was also that the regional focus was very broad. It was basically one process for a region of several hundreds of kilometers of a big territory. So people felt like this is actually not matching with my everyday experience of where I want to shape things. And I think this is also important to keep in mind here. So you have to find the right focus that people feel like this is meaningful to my daily life. And also there was a lack of local buy-in in the beginning, because these processes were seen as being imposed from the outside. There were participatory agencies coming in from Berlin or from other places, carrying out these kind of processes. What we see what worked better now over a longer period of time is that, for instance, if you target specific groups, like for instance, youth organizations, that these dedicated youth participation schemes were actually quite successful. And I have two colleagues of mine that do a lot of work on that. They said, if you take your time, if you really meet people where it makes sense, where it's important for them, then you actually find also good results about these participation processes. And also there were a number of bottom-up participation processes that were, sparked or initiated by local government, by mayors or so, then also driven by, support from the municipalities there. And some of them were actually also quite successful. The last point I want to make is what are the obstacles to the transition, and how far do we see local contestation as well? And I'm talking about this region that you see on the right-hand side here in the very eastern part of Germany. And what we have experienced there is that the transition is particularly challenging in this region because there's a strong skepticism towards the transition. People are concerned that it's not going to be a just transition for them. And so I think that there are a couple of factors that come into play here. One is that negative experiences of previous transitions also basically hamper the readiness to tackle those transitions yet to come. And so what we've seen in this region was that after the German reunification, after the socialist period of this part of Germany, that there was a breakdown, an economic breakdown that was also experienced very negatively on a personal level, because people lost their jobs, because people, felt also devalued for what they have done before. And I think that this experience still remains very strongly in the sense that people have the expectation it's going to be as bad as it was back then. Although this is not a realistic scenario, but people feel like it's going to be the same again. And I think it's important to talk about that, maybe also in contexts that are completely different, like, for instance, the South African case, because I would be interested also in discussing with you whether transitions happening here in this country, for instance, in the post-apartheid period, maybe also, still have a long shadow that, maybe has something to do with what people expect from future transitions to come. In these regions, and I think in many coal regions all over Europe, we see that the coal legacy is also glorified to a certain extent. So it's still seen as a regional anchor of identity, even though the economic relevance is actually not that high anymore. But people still feel like, this is the identity for an entire region. And if this economic activity is going away, also part of our, cultural identity is under pressure, kind of. This is something that we've seen in this region in our research. I think one thing that comes into play here is also that the environmental movements and also civil society in general are rather weak in the region. So the ones that could also lobby for seeing the chances of such a transition are actually underrepresented compared to other regions, other core regions you might compare it to. And also what we see strongly is that there is a certain rural-urban divide. So people, living in these rural areas where energy production takes place, feel like the decisions are taken somewhere else. In metropolitan areas, they are taken in Brussels, they are taken in Berlin. The people that are taking these decisions do not really know about what this challenge means on the ground. That's their perception, kind of, and do not take this seriously. And at the same time, people all over the country are consuming the energy without really, asking where it comes from, what it means, and so on. And whether or not these criticisms are valid, I think that's on another page. But still, I think it makes sense to, try to understand where this criticism comes from. And I don't have much time now to go into the details of, how we can deal with that. But I think that there's certainly some options of, mobilizing those more progressive actors in the regions. Maybe also accepting that you will not get everybody on the same page, that some of the trade unions, for instance, where this is really like their main interest to keep these industries up and running, will maybe never really agree to an ambitious transition in that sense. And so that you also have to accept their different interests. And even though I said that some of the participatory schemes were not so successful in the past, I would still say that, that we should still try to, establish meaningful options for participation, and really also options where people can actually, where their, their input makes a change. And so with this, I would leave it there, because I'm already at the end of my time, and I look forward to a discussion later on, and also to the other inputs now. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Konrad, for the very insightful presentation. I personally was very interested in your insights on justice, and and I hope we can engage on that some more. If you have any questions at this point, please write it in the chat, and we attend to the questions after all of the speakers have spoken. So that brings me to the next speaker, and I would like to welcome Paul Uoy. He's a professor for economics of sustainable energy transition at the Europa University or Universität Flensburg, and head of the group Fossil Exit at that university, which is also a collaboration between a university in Berlin and another research institute. And he is the head of the Transnational Center for Just Transition in Energy, Climate and Sustainability, which is the program that is targeting North, South cooperation with South Africa, Colombia, to enhance knowledge exchange, capacity building, and research on and with the Global South. Yeah, that's quite a mouthful. Thank you so much, Paulo. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Tina, for the nice introduction. Thanks, Gabriel and others for the organization of this event. And thanks for Konrad for giving a head start to bring us basically into the topic. And as Konrad already mentioned, we see our perspective as German scholars not in telling people in South Africa what to do, but we have studied intensively the German case study and would just like to share some experiences of positive as well as negative insights that we've had within our country. And of course, you cannot replicate something that you have done in Germany exactly like that in South Africa because the circumstances are very different. Nevertheless, we have made some mistakes in Germany, which you definitely, there's no need to repeat, etc. So therefore, there's, I think, still some lessons learned for other countries. And therefore, I've structured my talk into different topics. I will try to go through them relatively briefly to allow for questions and answers, as well as for general discussions. There will also be some figures and some illustrations. So if you have additional questions to them because I didn't explain everything properly, then feel free to say so. And also my slides can be afterwards received either by the organizers, or if you just contact me bilaterally, then you can have them. So just send me a note. I think it's important to understand in the history of coal that it has been a long history. And even though there has been a lot of political debate, especially in the last 10 years, which especially Konrad has also highlighted, there has been basically 50, 60 years before that where we had a reduction in coal production, which is basically the shaded figure here. And the line is basically the number of employees only in hard coal mining. So basically in Germany, we differentiate between hard coal and lignite being simply very bad quality hard coal, simplistically speaking, and we had more than 600,000 direct employees in the 50s in the hard coal sector. If you include indirect workers, you had more than 1 million people working there. And as you can see by this figure, basically at the end of 2018, we stopped subsidizing the sector, and therefore all the bigger hard coal mines were closed. We still have these open cast lignite mines, but the hard coal mines, like underground mines, they're all closed because it was too expensive. And basically we shifted from mining coal in Germany to importing coal also from South Africa because it was cheaper. Nevertheless, we also therefore had quite some transition experiences within different regions, which was mostly in the western part of Germany. And there were quite some challenges. Some things worked, other things didn't work that well. And there was also a lot of money that the government spent basically enabling this transition. Therefore, in the last year, something else came up, and it was mentioned already a bit slightly on the side with respect to the topic energy crisis. And of course, something that we cannot say is that the people that suffered most of the war in Ukraine are, of course, the people within the Ukraine. But in addition to basically what happened physically on the ground in Ukraine, there was a lot of disturbances, so to speak, within the fossil fuel sector in Europe in general, but also in particular in Germany. Germany in 2021 looked as such that Germany was buying more than 50% of its hard coal from Russia. We were buying 50% of our gas from Russia. We were buying a third of our oil from Russia. In the year 2023, where we are now, basically, we have stopped all imports from Russia, which means that we have basically diversified our fossil fuel imports. It's not that we have managed to get rid of all the fossil fuels, but we mainly just shifted from other importing countries. But this nevertheless has increased the pressure to basically get rid of fossil fuels, to use as little fossil fuels as possible, because these are fossil fuels which are being imported, and therefore for energy security issues, there has been a strong push to basically reduce energy demand, as well as basically to enhance the basically installation of renewables, which would basically act as a supplement for hard coal. And therefore, for this energy security issue, this has been a big topic. There's always been this debate in the last year, but what does it mean for coal if the debate in the media was not so much on coal, but more on gas and oil coming from Russia, where we would face struggles? What we've seen is that nevertheless, we have a lot of targets nationally in Germany, as well as internationally, for example, in the EU, but of course also on a global level, the Paris Agreement, which basically aim for a net zero future, which basically means that there is no room for any fossil fuels. So it is very clear that there will be no coal, oil, or gas basically used in Germany within the next decades at some point. And basically what we see is that at the moment, meaning 2023 and 2024, you might have a bit higher runtimes of coal due to the high electricity prices and due to some shortages that we had in gas, where we wanted to store gas just in case that the winter would get a bit colder. However, we also see that, for example, the CO2 prices, which are basically prices that you have to pay for each ton of CO2 that you're emitting, have increased. They used to be in the range of 20 to 30 euros, and now they're above 100 euros sometimes even. So therefore, we see that economically speaking, in Europe as well as in Germany, we will see the end of all coal power plants most likely by 2030. It might be that in the beginning of 2030s, there might be still some kind of capacity reserve in 4 hours where there's not enough renewables, etc. But those most likely will be just used for a couple of hours per year, which will lead to only low amounts of CO2. And therefore, there's very little room basically in the electricity sector of Germany for additional fossil fuels. We have a target of basically getting carbon zero within the electricity sector by 2035, which is basically in a bit more than 10 years, which also means that all our gas power plants basically at some point have to switch to green hydrogen or to other fuels of green fuels. And therefore, there's a lot of discussion at the moment. I think there's a certain risk in Germany as well as in other countries sometimes that when people switch from coal to gas, that they think that there's kind of still room for a bridge technology. However, this is not the case. If you look at the models, if you look also at the cost of gas, it doesn't really make sense to build new additional fossil infrastructure. In some cases, you will need a bit of smaller backup capacities, which might be filled with hydrogen at some point. However, in the long term, it is very clear that going 100% renewable will be the cheapest option and the option that Germany is basically rooting for at the moment. So therefore, what we can say from the experience in Germany, it is better to so-called leapfrog the tumbling gas bridge from coal directly to renewables, as they are much cheaper than any of the other alternatives, and renewables also are domestically being produced. So therefore, with respect to the energy security issues, this is something to have in mind. We are speaking a lot about how to enable a just, but as well an in-time transition. And of course, this in-time transition is, I think, a bit more important even for the global north and for the global south, because just transition should not mean that we should take more time, but it just means that we also have to take everything into consideration. And therefore, this complicated switch is basically from a fossil fuel-based economy to switch somewhat to a renewable energy system, which in many cases will be more decentralized. While before you had fossil fuel centers, basically regions where there's a lot of coal, and from there the electricity has to be transported to another area where there are load centers, industry centers, cities, etc. However, in the future, we are seeing more decentralized renewable energy system with lots of PV and wind everywhere, and therefore this is more efficient. The focus is very much then on the energy system, electricity grid installation. Of course, there's a lot of things that you have to do and have to keep in mind. However, something that shouldn't be forgotten is these additional elements of cohesion policy, structural policy levels, which do not only target workers and citizens, the economy and industry, but also infrastructure. Infrastructure not only being highways, but also being IT infrastructure, fast internet, etc. Internet access in Cape Town sometimes is better than in some cities in Germany. So therefore, this is really something to have in mind, that this is something that Germany also can improve a lot. Digitalization, education and research and soft location factor, we have found are particular of importance to motivate young people, to motivate skilled workers to stay within the coal regions, to come up with new ideas for new companies. And all this has to be financed in some kind of way. And so therefore, for all these to work in place, you need some kind of governance, you need multi-level planning, you need participation, consensus of relevant stakeholders, and the specific stakeholders, they might differ for each region, they might differ for each country, and you know best which people are to be considered within your country. But this is really something that we can learn a lot from how to do it and how not to do it. And there were some examples that also Konrad has highlighted already. I just want to show you also some additional figures by the International Energy Agency. So this is institution which is more, I would say, pro-industry. So this is not by an NGO. And therefore just highlighting what are the plans that are existing for a couple of countries, in this case, Canada, Germany, Korea, Poland, but also South Africa. We have certain net zero targets by some countries. We have national coal phase-out targets for some countries already existing. For South Africa, I think not yet existing. And then there's the question, this just transition, which additional measures should we tackle and which shouldn't be tackled? In green dots, we have basically policies which already have some funding behind it. And in blue, these are dots, which are policies which are announced. As you can see with respect to South Africa, a lot is announced, but it's still not clear exactly how everything is going to be funded. With respect to Germany, which I know most about, you see a lot of green dots. So there is a lot more funding behind it with respect to the support for workers, the support for industry development, as well as to a holistic support for coal communities, where you also need to think about environmental rehabilitation. What do you do with the coal regions? What do you do with the mine? How do you make the region livable afterwards, not only for industries, but especially also for people? And this is something to keep really in mind, and where we have quite some experience in Germany. The question is then always basically, from learning these lessons from Germany, how can we basically transfer some of these into the global south? And of course, there's a lot of things which we cannot transmit, but there are some lessons learned which I think are relatively general, but nevertheless helpful. First of all, something we've learned from, I think, more or less like 70 years of transition in Germany, you cannot guarantee future success of alternative industries, even if you would want to. In retrospect, you can always say, this is such a beautiful, nice story, it worked perfectly. However, if you look at the history, there are also some things which look nice, but they didn't work out. So you will never know for certain. You can hope, you can try your best, but it might also fail. So therefore, you shouldn't basically put all your cards in one basket, but you should diversify. Also, some coal regions will be worse off after the transition. It is important to be honest about this, because this will happen, and then communities will blame the governments if they weren't told so, and if people and politicians are just promising everything will be beautiful afterwards for everyone. This is not true. The thing is just that these transitions are kind of normal. This is something which you have in economic transitioning. This is what especially globalization, digitalization brings with it, that simply some regions have an increase of employment, others have a decrease of employment. This is a normal process. It does not mean that policy cannot do their work to soften these effects and to increase certain enhancement of structural cohesion in some areas. However, just because some regions will be worse off afterwards doesn't mean that not doing anything will reduce this or something. So basically, if you're not doing anything, things will just be worse. What you have to do is you have to go in, you have to improve the situation, and then some regions will be better off and some regions might still be worse off than before, but it's still better than not doing anything. It's important to diversify, be flexible, adjust if the environment is changing. There might be new policies, there might be new technological innovations, there might be new things happening within international neighbors, etc. So therefore, you have to adjust. You shouldn't come up with a strategy for the next 20 years, but we should come up with a strategy for the next 20 years. But in the time between, every 2 to 3 years, adjust it where necessary. You need to communicate future plans. This is about participation. Also get people aligned. Don't have a blue plan, basically, don't have a printout to plan for everything, but for specific regions where it's really fitting. I just want to highlight two things which I think are not always mentioned enough, which is with respect to how about the age and gender aspects within the different countries, in this case, especially also within the global south. And what you can see here, because basically the biggest issue, if we are honest, it's not about the existing coal workers, but it is about young people within the coal regions. It's about the next generations. What you can see here is basically the thousands of employees in different coal sectors in different countries. And you can see if coal miners would retire at the age of 60, then you see the red curve. If coal miners would retire at the age of 55, then you see the blue curve. People that work in the coal sector do a lot of hard work. Most of them normally retire in the 50s, simply because they cannot do the work anymore. So therefore, assuming that basically the workforce, if we are not hiring more people in the coal sector, is basically automatically being reduced following the blue line, means this is very much in line with the yellow line, and the yellow line being basically a climate scenario, which is including already a phase down of coal in all these areas. What I want to say is that it's not about letting people go within the coal sector, but it is being honest about the coal sector, that no more new people will be hired, but that the existing workforce can basically run the mines until the end of their usage. And what we need is new possibilities for new generations to find additional jobs. But it's not only about reskilling the existing workers, but about it's skilling the new generations fitting. Also, people very much focus always on men, because they think it's only male people working in the coal mining sector, which is not true, which is basically also the reason is that we have indirect workforce. What we see here is basically in this chart, basically in yellow, the indication of how high is the workforce of women within the coal sector, but this is only the direct coal sector. Basically, we have indirect coal sector where female employment is very much affected, and people are not really talking about this that much. So therefore, very often, there are major repercussions for women in the community. It's women that are bearing the heavy burden of the transition. If the men are not bringing in the money again, there is drug abuse, there is violence. We see women then basically getting additional jobs, having to basically sustain their family and the men. We see fragile masculinity being triggered by this. There's a lot of issues which need to be debated, which are currently not sufficiently covered in Germany, as well as in countries in the global south, to be taken care for. Very small advertisement, as was mentioned before, Trajects has basically different hubs, one hub being by the University of Cape Town, also basically as a hub for the African continent, working on these different topics, not only coal, but also other topics of climate, focusing on climate mitigation. Go to our website, trajects.org, where you can see a lot of possibilities, especially also for young people, for scholarships, etc. Some last concluding remarks before coming to a Q&A and then basically the discussions. What have we basically seen in our investigation of Germany as well as on other coal transitions in other countries is that, of course, it's different challenges for each and individual country and region. We see that the technical solutions are something that people always focus on, like how do we get renewables into the grid and stuff like this. And this is important. However, this is relatively easy and very well researched. Doesn't mean that we don't need research in this area anymore, but it means that this is something that we are very certain how to do it. I think yesterday we had a day of like more than 90% of renewables within the grid in Germany for a couple of hours where everything was stable, everything worked. So this is something where we can transfer some knowledge to other countries, but this is something which should work. Social political aspects need even more analysis because it's more complex. It is crucial to prevent new stranded investments into coal or gas. Don't invest any additional dollar in these kind of assets because it's not needed and will just basically hinder the needed transition to renewables. With respect to the transition for coal regions, what we've seen in Germany is basically those regions that started the transition, they will basically receive the biggest financial support by the governments, by international donors, etc. Therefore, they then have the best chances to diversify and improve. Therefore, if you are within a coal region, you have an incentive to start the transition, even if you don't believe that renewables are the future, just go for it. It's where the money is. And you will see that in the end, your community will be better off than those that have basically tried to ignore this trend, which will just result in a delayed economic collapse with lower chances for recovery, as we've seen in the past. And therefore, in addition to this, which I didn't talk about in this speech, but of course shouldn't be unmentioned, there will be the climate crisis happening. And therefore, this is basically one of the reasons why we also have to do this, as the consequence of the climate crisis for all economies are immense. Therefore, I'm sorry for being that fast, trying to get some things in here and looking forward to the discussion with you. And if you have questions directed to me, also feel free to send me an email or contact me via Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Lots of information there. So yes, let's get straight to the South African point of view. I mean, we had some information on South Africa, but now we have Hlengiwe Radebe speaking, and she is she's a civil society and youth engagement officer at WWF South Africa. And she has over 7 years of experience working with civil society organizations, youth, municipalities, and national government. And she has worked extensively in South Africa and other African countries on projects addressing urban energy challenges, equitable and inclusive low carbon development, and climate change mitigation and gender mainstreaming. And she holds a Master of Science in Interdisciplinary Global Change Studies from the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. And in 2019, she was awarded the Mail and Guardian Top 200 Young South African Award. Welcome, Hlengiwe. Please start your presentation.
Morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope my presentation will be as as interesting as the previous two presentations. Gabriel asked me to do a presentation on what is the current energy transition situation in South Africa. So I just thought to start from what we are currently experiencing at the moment in South Africa. Most South Africans know, and is South Africa's energy crisis is getting worse, mostly because of delayed reforms and persistent allegations of corruption that have gotten in the way of our transition. Our Eskom debt is very high at the moment, at around 423 billion, despite the support from from government. We all know a month ago, the national government said that over the next 3 years, would provide Eskom with a debt relief amounting to 254 billion. So that doesn't even cover the current debt that Eskom has. Other issues also that you're currently facing is the energy availability factor has decreased from 66% to 58% in 2002. In 2022, sorry, apologies. Load shedding, which what time is it? My load shedding is meant to start in 10 minutes. Load shedding has increased this year alone. There hasn't been a day without load shedding in South Africa. It has multiplied 16 times to 22 gigawatts, which is 157 full days in last year in 2022. Currently, people are without electricity for up to 10 hours a day, depending on the different stages that you are on. The tariffs have rose 34% to 140 cents per kilowatt in 2023, and Eskom is still trying to get the tariffs to go up. But the most important issue, what we are currently facing right now, is lack of implementation in South Africa. There are always new plans about how we tackle the energy crisis in South Africa, but there's no implementation of it. Key reforms that were meant to improve Eskom's financial sustainability, transparency and governance and operational performance have not been implemented. Failure to procure new power needed by the utility to improve supply has also not happened. Especially bring in renewables, Eskom, there hasn't been much in the past 2 years around that. On the other side, I found this this graph on LinkedIn by Gala, who works at TIPS. We put out this graph showing how renewable energy in South Africa is growing on an exponential growth. And this is driven by the private sector. So people are starting to realize that, particularly businesses are starting to realize that they cannot rely on Eskom. So they are putting up their own power, especially solar PV. So and we're seeing more and more of that, and also at household level. This is, I think, has been accelerated with the support of banks as well, that they've been putting up systems to provide support and loans for people who want to put up solar PV. However, this is not enough because it's leaving out majority of South Africans. The poor cannot afford solar panels at the moment. So they are still very reliant on Eskom, and so they will be stuck with the they'll be stuck with load shedding. In addition, while businesses are moving to solar PV, and some of them are even thinking of leaving the grid, that means our tariffs are going to be higher because businesses and high income earners subsidize the poor in South Africa. So if more and more of them start to move out of the grid, it means the low income households will have to cover have to pay the full energy price in South Africa, which currently they cannot afford. So there's definitely a need to look at how we can ensure that renewables are also accessible to low-income households as well. So why does SA need a just energy transition? So I decided to put this up to say, I feel South Africa in general has always been on energy transition since 1994, even pre-1994. So we, as you can see, some with the policies that have been put in place in the past years. The white paper that came in around about in 1996, 1998, the renewable energy white paper that came in around 2003. So some of these ideas around just energy transition aren't new. They've been coming out. Load shedding starting around 2008. So we've been in transition as a country. So as I said, South Africa has been on an energy transition, and I say this mostly because from 1990 to 2000 to 2023, electricity access has moved from 35% to 86%. Our electricity sector in the 1960s, our energy pool was built around the minerals for energy complex, in which energy generation relied heavily on coal production and abundant mineral from the countries from our country. The white paper on the energy policy came in 1998, and it was the first post-apartheid national energy policy on regulated framework. And in the document, it touches on increased access to affordable energy services, improving energy governance, stimulating economic development, managing energy-related environmental impacts, and securing energy supply through diversity. And I highlighted some of these keywords because these are some of the keywords that come up also in the just energy transition. So what we are discussing at the moment around just energy transition isn't new, because we have been discussing it for a few years now. The white paper energy policy of 1998 opened off-grid electrification and instituted subsidized energy access. Energy subsidies were impacted by removing value-added tax on paraffin, for example, which is particularly used in low-income households for cooking. In addition, with the free basic electricity policy, which was targeted at providing free electricity to typically poor households at 50 kilowatts per month. This unit of electricity is estimated to be sufficient to cover basic household needs such as lighting, heating, cooking, and powering electronics. I think depending on the municipalities, the FBE is implemented at a municipal level. Depending on the municipalities, it ranges between 50 kilowatts and 70 kilowatts depending on the municipalities in the place. Another policy that was put in was National Energy Act, which shaped the legal framework of the energy provision within tackling the nexus of poverty alleviation, environmental management, and economic growth. We also had the integrated resource plan, a very sticky issue, which is a long-term strategic energy plan covering 2010 and up to 2030, and the implementation of the RRP is affected by ministerial determination as regulated by the electricity regulation. The RRP outlines strategies for doubling power generation capacity through a mixture of renewable and non-renewable energy sources. We also have National Development Plan, which is the overall vision that we have as a country, which proposes renewable supply to 20 megawatts of the projected 20,000 megawatts of the projected 29,000 megawatt expansion of the power sector by 2030. So I wanted to highlight this because we have been in a transition in South Africa, and our target has always been about affordable energy, about ensuring the addressing environmental impact and securing energy supply. And wanted to highlight that we've been successful at some other things, and we've been successful at other things. For example, the free basic electricity was a good idea, yet it's not enough. 50 kilowatts is not enough for lighting and heating and cooking and powering electronics. But it was a good idea that was implemented in the country. We started discussing renewables in the country around 2003. So we've been in this transition as a country since then. So why we need a transition? So an energy transition is a shift from current energy system to one that is better in terms of sustainability, environmental impact, climate change, human health, and economics, as mentioned in the previous policies that have been highlighted. Why we need to transition from the current systems, particularly in South Africa, is we are in Africa, we're #1 in terms of emissions. We need to issues of climate change. We are seeing issues how climate change is impacting us, and that's why we need to continue to reduce our emissions in the country. If you hear stories from people living in Mpumalanga, you hear about them, how their kettles are dying, how their families are dying because of the pollution, water pollution from the mines, air pollution from the mines. So that's why we need the transition. Also, coal is no longer the cheapest option at the moment. Renewables are becoming cheaper and cheaper every day. So that's why we need the energy transition. But in particular, why we need it to be just, because I think in the past few years we're focused on an energy transition, and we've often forgotten the justice part of it. The just why it needs to be just, and the reason why we need it to be just is that so to protect the people who could be negatively affected by the transition, to provide social equity, and to facilitate cooperation between stakeholders. So in the JET IP, they say a just energy transition can attract investment, create new industries and jobs, and help us to achieve energy security and climate resilience. So when we talk about justice in South Africa, I think the previous speaker also spoke to this as well, is the distributive justice. And we need to have restorative justice and procedural justice. And around distributive justice, this is from the PCC just transition framework, that the document that they put out last year is around distributive justice. The risk and opportunities resulting from the transition must be distributed fairly among gender, race, and class. We cannot have the poor being the most impacted. So we need everyone to absorb the risks and opportunities that will come with the just energy transition. And the cost of adjustments are borne by those historically responsible for them. So, and I think that's very important. And we need to find ways of how we're going to ensure that the cost of the transition are held by those who are previously responsible. Restorative justice looks at damages against individuals, communities, and the environment must be addressed with a particular focus on rectifying the situations of harmed or disenfranchised communities. It is about redress, healing people and the land, which was an immediate need to echoed by all communities that the PCC has consulted with. Procedural justice, workers, communities, and small businesses must be empowered and supported in the transition, with them defining their own development and livelihood. It is about embracing the assessment, nothing about us without us. I think South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, and with the just energy transition, we need to be careful that those who are already ahead don't continue to benefit and leave those who are behind not benefiting, and we continue the same trends that we have been seeing. Right now, as I said, the tariffs are getting higher, which means people are getting more and more into energy poverty. So with the just energy transition, we also need to ensure that as we transition, those who are poor are able to afford energy, because it's such a critical component of our lives. People are able to run businesses in South Africa. So that we need to keep in mind as we transition. And particularly, as we say, is I think the job losses. And when we talk about job losses, is that it's not just about the mine workers who are going to lose their jobs. It's the people who surround who have built their business around the mines who are going to lose their jobs. It's the women who have set up informal businesses in the schools, around the mining schools. But it's also the teachers and the nurses who are based in the mining communities. If mines start shutting down, it means people might start to relocate. What happens to those schools and the clinics that have been built? Majority of that means that communities they will have ghost towns. So we need to, the transition needs to think of that. And with that, it also comes with community displacement, a sense of self. We are so attached to the people that we have grown up with. And if there's no economic activity around the town, it means people will start to move around and having to go to places that are new and unfamiliar to them. So they will have to develop new societal connections with people that they do not know. And also they will use their traditional systems. Something as simple as burial sites. So people are attached to burial sites and the people that have passed on. The changes in towns can affect that. And again, loss of revenue because of the closure of mines and all of that. So these are things that need to be considered when around the just energy transition. So, and I think now South Africa is sort of starting to address just energy transition and realizing that we need the money, we need a lot of money to be able to transition, money that as South Africa will not be able to have. We need support from others to be able to implement the just transition. And we've been able to mobilize 8.5 billion for investment in South Africa's transition towards renewable energy over the next 3 to 5 years. And 3 to 5 years is between 2023 to 2027. And this plan was announced in November 2021. And it's a partnership between South African government and governments from France, the UK, United States, and European Union. And there are others who are interested in coming in as well to provide financing for South Africa. And the investment plan, and what then happened is that South Africa then put together an investment plan that sets out financing principles and preferred terms and conditions of how the just transition should be implemented. And the plan aims to meet South Africa's nationally determined contributions while promoting a whole of society approach to climate finance. So the plan really looks to decarbonize the economy to within the target range by 2030 based on the NDCs. So what the plan has done, which I think is great, is to map out beyond the 8.5 billion, is to say, actually, we need 1.5 trillion as a country for our energy transition between now and 2027. And there are multiple sources that the country is looking at for that, which is developed countries to provide finance, private sector investors, development finance institutions, government, philanthropies, and multilateral development banks. And in the just energy transition investment plan, South Africa has particularly decided to focus on 3 key areas because of their contributions towards carbon emissions, which is electricity, green hydrogen, and new energy, electric vehicles as well, with 2 cross-cutting areas which have been brought up by particular civil society organizations and youth skills development as well, and would look at and also bring in municipalities because they play a key role in supplying electricity. And through a just transition, and the focus of this is that it must protect the vulnerable workers and communities, build energy security, expand energy access, promotes industrial development, drives innovation, develops sustainable livelihoods, enables economic diversification, and ensures that there's inclusive economic growth. And this is aligned to the National Development Plan and the Just Transition Framework. So as we know, this was the money that has been offered, and majority of it is around concession loans, commercial loans, and guarantees. Very little of it is, I think, less than 3% is grants, which is, I think, from a youth perspective is worrying, because it means that because there's a lot of debt that has come through. But also, I think some of the what has been coming through is that why the grant component has been so low is that it hasn't come through how can the grants provide support in the justice aspect of the thing. So we need to highlight how for funders to say, okay, this is the justice part of the just energy transition in terms of skills development, offering subsidies. This is where they could possibly allocate their grants towards if we were looking to increase grants. And much of the money that has been put forward, majority of it is towards the infrastructure, which is good. However, it is leaving out skills development. The social, the justice part of it is being left out. There's very little money around skills development, economic diversification, innovation, and social investment and inclusion. So we do need to increase the amounts towards these areas that address justice in our country. And a few weeks ago, there was an engagement by Fair Finance for All, and some of their concerns, which are mostly what a lot of civil society share, is that the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, the plan does not speak to community involvement and the role and their role in the transition. And I think we're worried about this because, of course, communities are going to be the most impacted, particularly, for example, the communities in Mpumalanga. So we need their involvement and how they're going to be part of the implementation, part of monitoring and evaluation, as and how they're going to benefit from all of this needs to be clearly highlighted. And at the moment, it's not clearly defined. The role and development of public finance institutions, it's not clear how they will be involved, to what extent. While we do want the money from public finance institutions, we do not want them to be detecting how we are going to do the just energy transition in South Africa. They can provide guidance, but they shouldn't be detecting how we do it. We do need our voices in South Africa, the people in South Africa guiding this. So there's still worries around that. And then, as I said, also majority of the money is going to infrastructure, which is apartment. Most of it is going towards ESCOM, funding ESCOM. And right now we have heard about the corruption at ESCOM, and the worries want that the money that is now being put aside for that also be get caught in the corruption.
Hlengiwe? Can everybody else hear me still, or are we?
I can hear you. I think we just lost Hlengiwe's network, but I think if she jumps in, she can bring it to a close in the discussion. But I think perhaps Hlengi, if you can, I'll just stop the share of the screen, and then we can maybe continue just with these concerns at heart as we build into the discussion going forward. Tina, do you have any words before we move on?
No, just please, I think we are very short on time, so I hand over to you for the discussion.
Excellent. So I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone, Konrad, Pauyu, and Hlengiwe for your contribution to the space. We allowed Hlengiwe a little bit more time because she is one person providing the South African perspective, which is quite a big one, and two German perspectives. And so we also are deciding to kind of move a little bit now of the kind of Q&A and merge it more with the discussion, because I think that's how it organically was going to happen anyway. And so I think this is a perfect opportunity. Should everyone have any questions, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I can get us rolling with a question or two that I've got prepared. But I think maybe just to see in the crowd, does anyone have any questions? You can either pop it in the chat or you can raise your hand and we'll permit you to unmute. Nobody? There we go. Michelle, go for it.
Thank you. I just thought I'd say hello also from Tragics, South Africa. Hi, Payu. Nice to see you online. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for the, both those inputs. And so I wanted to ask our German colleagues about, given that there's a war in Ukraine, there's this demand for fossil fuels still, I mean, in the form of coal, how does that implicate on also Germany's commitments for just energy transitions, sort of, broadly in the global south, and their finances? And then also that Europe has imposed, is or about to impose, the carbon border tax. And that's going to have also huge implications for countries like South Africa as we, have these huge challenges with our coal phase out. So yeah, so I'm just feeling a bit concerned with some of the double standards emerging from from the global, Europe, the European Union around the demands for the just transitions, and then also lastly the issues about finances, and that we're not really taking into account the structural changes in global finance with financialization through profits and the conditions that comes with these loans and these investments. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And maybe given that your colleague is here, we can pause to poll you and see if Konrad has any additions to add, given the question is German focused. I've seen Hlengiwe has joined us now, but just a short answer as possible. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this important question. I think first of all to note, we and many other scientists would have preferred that Germany would have accelerated renewables even beforehand, so that we wouldn't even have come into the position of being that dependent on fossil fuels. Given the situation in 2022 that we are still and still are dependent on fossil fuels, basically cutting back on Russian fossil fuels meant that Germany, as a change, then had to buy fossil fuels from other countries, which was basically not what we would have wanted, but was basically the only thing that could be done at that point in the short term. However, something that can only be emphasized is this did not change the midterm and long-term strategy of Germany, and this was just more trying to look for additional coal for the next 5 years, maybe. And this is why we would call for all countries that basically profit from the spikes of higher coal prices, higher gas prices, higher oil prices we're currently still seeing, to use this money to invest in a just transition, because in parallel, while we still needed to buy these additional fossil fuels, the acceleration of renewables and the reduction of energy demand also took place and was basically enhanced. So therefore, the aim is still to phase out coal even faster than before the crisis. In the western part of Germany, moving it down from 2038 to 2030. In the eastern part of Germany, we are still discussing it this year, but it will most likely also be moved to the early 2030s. So therefore, things haven't changed. I would have preferred that there would have been even less fossil fuel dependency. But if you are in this dependency, it takes time to transition from it. And this will be the next 10 years, basically.
Thank you for that. Konrad, do you have anything to add to that? Otherwise, moving to the next question.
Yeah, not much. I mean, there would be small things, but for the sake of time, maybe we take another question. And if there's still time, I can still raise my comments later on.
Brilliant, thank you. I think what you said, Payu, is quite important to note as well, is that it is quite disappointing to see that kind of double standard. I mean, last year in a discussion with civil society, youth organizations from across the world at COP27, Chancellor Olaf Scholz made it very clear that investment in gas on the African continent was still quite a big priority, despite German government's want to go through this kind of end of fossil fuels, especially given the Glasgow Pact at COP26 stating that no new investment in fossil fuels would be made. And so I think this is a very important thing to note. So thank you so much for that. And then I see a question in the chat. I just wanted to ask the extent of the urban-rural divide in Germany. I know Konrad touched on this in his PowerPoint. I know in South Africa, the rural is not taken into account despite being highly impacted by climate change. And so I think the question is more on the I think it's the extent of the urban-rural divide in Germany. I see Karen has raised a hand as well. I'm not sure if she has an answer for that. Otherwise, Konrad. Karen, is it a hand to answer? Or
it's a hand for a question. Sorry.
Okay, well, in a moment, no problem.
Okay, well, then maybe I can go ahead first. I mean, what we see in the German case, and what I also tried to raise here, is that energy infrastructures are, like back in the time of fossil fuels, they were very often located close to the places where the mining was, and particularly with the case of what Pao Yu mentioned about lignite mining. It's even stronger so because you usually do not export this kind of low quality coal very far away. That means wherever it is mined, there's also the power stations there. Now, of course, as Pao Yu said, this transition is happening anyways, and it's inevitable. But I think what we should think about more strongly is the question of well, if we bring in new infrastructures, both energy infrastructures, but also other kinds, how do we distribute here the burdens and benefits? And I think that's an important one to think about that, because also renewable energies raise at certain points maybe opposition, and that is a thing that we can see. Although the kinds of burdens are of a completely different kind of the ones that we see with fossil fuels, but still people might object to it. At the same time, you also have a lot of benefits coming in with kinds of, employment being attracted with other kinds of investments. How you mentioned that also, that maybe it's not energy infrastructure, but other kinds of industries that you try to attract. And I think it's important to, not just let this happen somehow, and the transition, will just, find its way, and you have investment somewhere or not. But really to also think about how you can actually direct this. And I think so, if you are looking for a just transition, then one option can be also to say, well, maybe we have the best conditions for renewable energies in the Western Cape or in the Northern Cape or so. But because we also want to, bring investments into, let's say, the Mpumalanga region, because it will suffer from this, coal exit, it makes sense, to also direct certain investments into particular regions. And I think that's the point that's the bottom line that we should be thinking about. When you try to make transitions just, also think about where do we want to have the location for future economic activities.
My question comes a little bit on the back of that, and it relates to, I guess, the how and the what of diversifying the economic regions you've spoken about in Germany. And I guess I'm just quite curious about, the how. So what kind of efforts were made to diversify the economies and what these actually resulted in? So what kind of industries did you see come in? And I guess it's different for every region, so you're welcome to use a particular example. And within that question, there's also a question about to what extent were these diversification efforts structural shifts in the economy. So I think Hlengiwe mentioned care work, and Pao Yu, you mentioned women and the impact of the coal exit on gender roles. And I'm wondering to what extent, I think we often talk about diversification and the transition in terms of replacing jobs for the recognized forms of work that we see, rather than perhaps rethinking about what kind of work and livelihoods we would like to see. So I'm wondering to what extent was there maybe some nods or openness to that.
Thank you for that, Karen. Konrad, Pao Yu, I see your hand there. Go for it.
Okay, so I'll give a quick start. As you mentioned, it's complicated. It depends really on the region. I'll just try to note a couple of examples. So, for example, what we've seen in the Saarland, which is basically close to France, there was basically a shift from basically coal and steel towards car manufacturing industry, which was due to the fact that the car manufacturing industry was at that point in time in the 60s looking for new areas to invest in. So they had an uptake within the industry and then invested in that region. There were a lot of tax benefits, etc. They did not shift their strategic or main offices into the region, which therefore resulted now, when there is a downturn in the car industry, that the region is now suffering, because basically these are side offices which are going to be closed, and there's no R&D, there's no head offices, there's no strategic benefit in the area. It's just basically additional facilities, so to speak. We've seen in the Ruhr area, which is in the western part of North Rhine-Westphalia, more or less near Cologne and other areas there. We've seen different shifts. We've seen some that also didn't work. We've seen a lot of investment in the medical facilities and the logistics sector, which is due to the fact that it's very well connected to their neighboring countries. So the infrastructure was there. I think something to keep in mind in the future is that in addition to this energy transition from coal to renewables, we also have this transition of more globalization, more digitalization. So these male manufacturing jobs or male connoted manufacturing, these don't exist in Germany, as they cannot compete anymore with the global standards. So therefore, this is nothing to do necessarily just with energy wise, but there's just a bigger need for the care sector, for childcare, for teaching, for taking care of elderly people. We have huge demands of missing skilled labor forces, especially in the eastern part of Germany, because young people just leave the area. So it's not so much to find new jobs, but it's really just to motivate people to stay in the area. This is a real struggle. We have a huge issue there in Germany.
Thank you for that. I'm actually going to ask Konrad if you can share that after. I'm just looking at the time, and I do see 3 questions popped up. And there is one that was shared anonymously, and if you wish for your name to be shared, I'm happy to, but otherwise I'll just share it in the chat for everyone to see. And it's directed, I'm assuming, to Hlengiwe. When it comes to public consultation on the JET IP, it has been very limited. How do we action change in communities and with them if they have been left out of the initial discussion? And then perhaps we can also from there see if there's any other discussion as it relates to public consultation from the German perspective. But Hlengiwe, do you wish to jump in on that?
Thanks, Gabe. Yes, I guess the good things that there are public consultations, second round of public consultations that are happening. I think they kick off from next week with starting next week with the youth ones happening next week Friday. So there's an opportunity. I think one is that for us as civil society organizations to go to our communities and engage them and engage them and make them aware of what is currently happening, because I think the just energy transition is going to impact so many of us, and yet not all of us are being engaged. So I think it's our responsibility as civil society organizations to see if there's a gap in communities that have been left out, to go and reach out to them and ensure that their voices are heard. But also it's an opportunity for us. My experience with the PCC is that they listen when we engage and complain about engagement, is to go to PCC and ask them to engage the communities that we feel are being left out, so that their voices can be heard. So it's our responsibility, just creating awareness, but also creating awareness with the pieces to say engage all of these civil society organizations before you finalize any plans that you may have as well. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Hlengiwe. I think I hope that question was answered, and I think your point about the Presidential Climate Commission being a body that I'm not sure and I believe in initial discussions, I'm not sure Germany has got a body or committee as functional as perhaps the PCC, and this is just me tooting South Africa's horn a little bit, but I think while there is a lot of work still to be done, what Hlengiwe is saying, the beginnings of it is at least how we begin to move. I see your hand, Sele, and then I'll move to the question in the chat from Nolutando.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I hope you guys can hear me okay. As we have discussed previously, yes, load shedding can really mess around with, the signal and those types of things. I am mindful that our time is very tight. I wanted to say a huge thank you for this opportunity to come together, to hear what is going on in Germany, to be able to reflect on what's happening in South Africa. It's something that is so key, and some of the questions that have come up have touched on it as well, that for us to be able to know that the situation in South Africa looked at from a certain perspective, we can see that we have been doing a lot. We've been doing it for a long time. We are engaging and we've got the policies in place. So part of my question is kind of a question to each and every one of us. What are we doing? So I love that question that came up that said, in terms of, you know, public participation and those types of things, what can we do to get it out in the communities? It's the things that we are doing and that we need to continue to do, and perhaps do on a broader scale as well. That we change the narrative from, oh my goodness, who's going to come save us here? And that we can actually come forward, and as we have done today, to say, right, here's the experience. This is what we learned. Here's what we've done. This is what works. This is maybe what doesn't work. So just again, a huge thank you to everybody that presented today. Just in terms of, you know, Gabe saying, tooting a little bit, want to put out a challenge there to people. As we've discussed, the Presidential Climate Commission, they are currently looking for people to comment. So, you know, get hold of them and comment on what they're doing. Here in Cape Town, we are currently busy saying nuclear energy is a problem because, you know, of the huge nuclear waste issues. So let us make sure that we are commenting and saying we don't want something, instead of always just, you know, social media, oh no, look what happened to us, but what are we doing? So I believe there's also a march coming up for system change. So let's all get there, you know, and so thank you for allowing me to join on this platform, because I believe that as youth, as civil society, as faith leaders, as I know earlier they were speaking about whatever your identity is, whatever your organization is, wherever you are placed in the world, that we can keep coming together, because we need to stop the silos. We need to stop making like, oh no, it's your issue, it's not my issue. We could hear from what the Germans were sharing with us. It's all of our issue. We're all being affected in such similar ways. So thanks again. Go well, and let's keep up the good work, guys.
Thanks so much, Cele. I think you might as well have that might as well have been the wrap up. I can end it right here, but I definitely think what you've said is quite an important thing. It's breaking those silos, it's building those connections, it's finding further platforms. And I'll talk about ongoing things to come, but I'm going to take the last question in the chat before we bring it to a close today. Should you have any more questions, please feel free to email the email address I'll pop into the chat, and we'll make sure that it gets to the different panelists. The question from Noluthando is, thank you for your first goes, thank you for your insightful session. Everyone, to what extent was business involved in the transition when looking at the German case studies? I unfortunately have to drop off, so hopefully that question can be fed back once Nolu reviews the video. So to what extent was business involved in the transition when looking at the German case studies? And so I'm assuming this might be a more South African related kind of question towards you, Hlengiwe, but I also open the space if Konrad or Pau, you know the kind of exact areas that was. If not, it's a question that I will research and send information to afterward.
Yeah, well, maybe I can just give it a start, and Paul, you can complement. The way I saw the question in chat, I think it was also referring to the German case. So in generally in Germany, there's a tendency to always try to, you know, get everybody on board and find a compromise where everybody agrees to, kind of. So this has a very long tradition also. In this coal phase-out commission that we talked about today, business was not directly involved. There were some, you know, higher level boards that were, you know, complementing, or different, you know, business, different companies from the energy field that were part of it. I would still say that business also had a virtual seat at the table, because even the, the industrial trade unions and some parts of the regional politicians also brought in this interest quite strongly. What was very controversial in the German case was that there was also compensation being paid to these coal companies. I think that is a very, debatable point, and there was strong criticism to that also from an environmental point of view. So those coal companies that basically, had to, change their business model just a few years earlier because they would have changed it anyways, basically got compensation in the range of several billion euros for, agreeing to this kind of transition. And I think that the danger that was seen was otherwise they would maybe go to court, which happened, for instance, with the German nuclear industry, that they basically said, well, they are destroying our business model, now we go to court. I still see this as very, a very critical point, and I don't think that is a way you should do it. But I mean, we're also talking about in Germany mainly about private actors, and I think maybe the situation here in South Africa is a little bit different with Eskom being a mainly publicly owned entity. But Pao-Yu, if you have anything to add to that, please go ahead.
No, I would agree with what you said. I think also in general, business companies know their way into the political decision-making processes, whether this is through direct participation in these bigger rounds or just talking to the mayors, the labor unions, etc. So this is, Germany is very industry friendly. Just putting this objectively out there. So therefore this, I think one important lesson is it is not sufficient to include the businesses that are currently profiting from the coal sector, but it is important to give a seat at the table to potential new business operators, which could be renewables, but could be also in other areas. We spoke with Karen before about other care sectors, other issues which might be not only related to energy. You will not be replacing just coal with renewables, but you replace coal with renewables, and a lot of different other opportunities for cohesion policies could be agroecology, etc. So therefore, these other new potential, maybe more sustainable business entities, they should be given a seat at the table, as well as, of course, the communities that they come up with business ideas or community ideas in general. It's not.
Thank you for those contributions. Hlengiwe, do you have anything you'd like to add? Brilliant. Well, on that note, I do want to say a massive thank you to Konrad, to Pao-Yu, and to Hlengiwe for your amazing contributions today. I would like to thank everybody in attendance here today for your participation, for just kind of being present and helping hold space for one another as we discuss this. I mean, these aren't just supposed to be we're talking to you, but also us learning in our different spaces. I mean, when we talk about experts on the poster, we had quite a bit of a conversation about what does that actually mean, or what does an expert look like? And I think we are all experts within a certain lens of our own experiences. And so I think we all bring something expert to the conversation. And going forward, we look forward to building more of those discussions. On behalf of Project 90 by 2030 and Heinrich Böll Stiftung, I just want to say a massive thank you to the panelists again, a massive thank you to everyone involved. In the future, as we go on, we hope to engage on various other opportunities and other conversations and strategic discussions, maybe inviting some more kind of youth perspective from Germany, from like grassroots mobilization, as I know that we touched on, for example, Lützerath, but perhaps hearing about how the actual forced removal of activists from that zone has undergone in the last while, talking to people from Imalahleni and more here in South Africa, engaging with trade unions, both in Europe and in South Africa, and figuring out how that dynamic looks, wanting to diversify the conversation as much as possible. A massive, massive thank you. And I wish you all a good rest of your day. In the chat is the email address that you can use for any other questions that you may have. Otherwise, all information, presentations, and more will be circulated with the recording after today's meeting. Thank you all, and I wish you a good day. Bye-bye.